And we should be good to go. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, my embraced family, and welcome to our weekly Wednesday discussion. Now, I know that we advertised Sister Rashida to be leading the discussion tonight, but tonight she actually has another engagement. So tonight I will be leading our discussion, and next week Sister Rashida will pick up where I leave off. But with that, as everyone knows, we've been going over the book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration of the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander for the past, I would say, 2 to 3 months. And alhamdulillah, we are actually about to finish this journey together. We are starting tonight the final chapter titled The Fire This Time. And as most of us here know, this book was written back in 2010. So even though it's been a decade, everything in this book is still very, very relevant to this day. But this book has been educating us on how this new issue of mass incarceration is, how the author describes it, a new type of Jim Crow, a new type of racial caste system, a system that unjustly and disproportionately oppresses minority groups, especially those who are African American. And we've been going over this book for the past few months, and now we are about to finish this book with the final chapter. And like I mentioned, the name of this chapter is The Fire This Time, which the primary focus of this final chapter is that the author basically suggests to the reader what are some plausible action items that the reader must take in order for them to address this issue. And the author stresses, and this is something all of us really want to focus on, the author stresses that this book, the purpose of this book is not to tell us what we can do to address this issue. The primary purpose of this book is really to bring this issue to light, to really show the readers that this is truly an issue worthy of our attention, right? And that in regards to how to properly address the issue, for the most part, the author is leaving that job up to us, up to those who are her audience, right? But the primary purpose of this chapter is really to give some suggestions to the reader on what are some of the first steps to really start addressing this issue. So as usual, we'll start the chapter with me giving us just a very brief overview of the first part of the chapter, which again shouldn't be more than 25 minutes or so. So it shouldn't take that much time. Then from there, we will open the floor for discussion. Now, I mentioned this for those who came a little earlier, but what we're going to do from now on is after I give the summary, we are going to go ahead and stop the live stream and continue the discussion offline with all of us who are joining on Zoom. That way, everyone is able to ask questions, share their thoughts without the fear of the entire world watching them, right? You leave that worrying to people like me and other presenters. Because I really want us all to share our thoughts and really have an engaged discussion. I know it can be very hard when you know that the program is being live streamed and those who you don't know can hear you. So we're going to stop the live stream after I give the summary, and then from there, we'll keep the Zoom floor open for discussion after that, inshallah. But with that, we'll go ahead and start. But before we start, I just have a really quick video I want to share with everyone, which is kind of about a case that the author speaks about in the beginning of the chapter. And so I'm going to play a video for everyone, only probably about 2 to 3 minutes of the video. Then from there, we'll stop, and then I'll pick up where the author leaves off after discussing this particular case. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for all of you, so that way you'll be able to see the video. Give me 1 second. So I'm only going to play about 2, 3 minutes of this video. And this video is basically about a particular case that the author discusses in the beginning of the chapter. And some of you actually may be somewhat familiar with this particular case. So that's what we're gonna play just 2 to 3 minutes of it at first, and then after they finish with the summary, we'll stop and come back to the actual chapter itself.
Louisiana, after a major reversal in a case that has split a community along racial lines. The Gina 6, black teenagers in Louisiana charged with beating a white student last December. Now the conviction of one of those young men has been tossed out. Here now, a look back at how we got to this point. The chain of events began under this tree at Gina High School. Like the town itself, the school is mostly white. The unwritten rule was that the tree was a meeting place for white students only. But last year, several black students sat under the tree. The next day, 3 nooses hung from the branches. To the black community, the message was clear.
I was very offended because that's a racial slur against us.
But some white residents said it was no big deal.
I think a couple boys made a mistake, but I think it's all being blown out of proportion.
From there, tension between white and black students escalated. Then in December, a white student, Justin Barker, was knocked unconscious and kicked as he lay on the ground. Some said Barker provoked the fight, but his parents told us Justin didn't do anything, and they believed he could have been killed.
Several lacerations in both sides. Both ears was kind of really damaged, and both eyes. His right eye was the worst. It had blood clots in it.
This is the picture taken by police at the hospital. Justin was released the same day and attended a school ceremony later that night. A few days later, 6 black classmates were charged with attempted murder. Carwin Jones, Bryant Purvis, Robert Bailey Jr., and Theodore Shaw all faced the prospect of life in prison. A 5th teenager, whose name hasn't been released, was also charged with attempted murder as a juvenile. Charges against Jones and Shaw were later reduced to aggravated second-degree battery and conspiracy to commit battery, which could mean more than 20 years in prison. In June, Michael Bell, the first to go on trial, was found guilty of the same charges. He was supposed to be sentenced on September 20th. It had taken an all-white jury 3 hours to reach the verdict. Now, however, a Louisiana appeals court has ruled that Bell should have been tried as a juvenile, and his adult convictions have been thrown out.
We're happy right now, but tomorrow's another day. We are prepared for any contingency that may arise in this case. The first step was to get the conviction reversed. Now we have other hurdles that we have to go through in this particular case.
District Attorney Reed Walters now has the option of filing the same charges against Bell in juvenile court. In the meantime, Bell remains locked up in jail where he has been since the attack at the school last December.
And our Sean Caleb's is...
I can't hear you.
So as you guys saw from the video, this was a case that involved 6 black teenagers who basically severely beat a white teenager due to some racial tensions going on at the school. They were, as you guys saw, they were convicted for attempted murder as adults, which caused like this mass protest movement in the U.S. to the point where you saw CNN actually was doing regular updates on this case. So it's something that got a lot of national attention, and as you all saw, eventually those particular adult criminal charges were dropped. And the author begins the chapter with discussing this case. And there's really 2 main points she wants to highlight from this case, because she mentions that, during these protests, there was these predictions that a lot of people were making that this was going to cause a new type of civil rights movement against unjust treatment towards minorities in the criminal justice system. That ended up not really happening on that time, or at least to the degree that we would have liked to see it. The other kind of highlights 2 really disturbing points about this particular case that she wants the reader to kind of get from this summary that she gives about that case. The first point she highlights is, as we saw, these kids were about to lose their entire lives for what they did. Attempted murder charges, they were going to be in prison for the rest of their lives, and some, at the very least, 20 years for another one that was charged for battery. And until all these mass protests happened where those criminal charges were either dropped or they were charged as juveniles, thus lessening the severity of the case. She highlights two things. Number one is the author asks the question is, where was all this uproar and outcry for these types of charges towards young Black teenagers who were criminally charged as adults for drug-related crimes that were non-violent and didn't actually put anyone in the hospital, unlike this particular case here. And she kind of makes us kind of question ourselves as to how the parents of the children who are now in prison for decades or longer for drug-related charges, and no one is calling up for their justice. So she makes that's the first point that the author makes. So the second point she makes, which is really the primary focus of this chapter, is she says that one of the primary reasons this case gains national attention is kind of the trigger to what happened. Basically, as we saw in the video, there was mention of how nooses were tied up on the tree, as basically we all know, of course, what this means. It was basically a racial slur statement kind of being attributed to the Jim Crow era. And she mentions that if that didn't happen, if the cause of all this was not those nooses being put up on the tree, making an obvious racist statement, then this case would not have gotten national attention. She said these children would have been charged with the charges that were put towards them originally, and the world would not have made a peep. The primary reason she argues that this case got national attention is because of those nooses being tied up onto the tree, which is a call back to the old Jim Crow era. And she makes that point as kind of an opening to her chapter, which is basically her main argument of this chapter is, in order for us to properly address this new type of what she calls this new type of Jim Crow, this new type of unjust systematic treatment of minorities, it can't be done through the lens of how society uses racism as they did in the Jim Crow era. She basically calls for a new approach and a new type of public consensus on what racism is. And she argues that basically this new type of racism is not quite like the racism in the Jim Crow, hence why it's very difficult for people to recognize these types of injustices because it's seen as something that is colorblind. And hence why she says it wasn't for those nooses being hanged up on the tree, though no one would have been a peep for those teenagers being charged as adults with attempted murder for beating up a white teenager. And this kind of goes into, from here she starts speaking about the role of the civil rights advocate. She basically brings up a question of if this new type of mass incarceration is a new type of racial injustice, as she calls, then how come there's not a civil rights movement going on? How come the civil rights advocates aren't putting so much focus on it? And she gives three primary reasons as to why she feels this particular issue of mass incarceration hasn't got a lot of attention in the civil rights community. The first thing she mentions, of course, is that it has gotten some attention, but not to the degree as during back in the 1950s, 1960s, during the civil rights era. And she gives three reasons as to why she feels that's the case. Number one is she says that the civil rights community, just like everyone else, is not immune to falling for racial stereotypes or this type of what we're speaking about for the past 4 months, this unconscious bias that we're speaking about. she says that civil rights advocates are not immune to this unconscious bias, just like the rest of us aren't. And so she highlights that's kind of like the first reason she feels as to why the civil rights community hasn't really focused much on this issue is because of this issue of, well, these are individuals who deserve it. This is kind of typical of the Black community, that they fall into these types of, it's a behavioral problem, not a racial problem. So that's number one. Number two is she speaks about how the civil rights community has changed from the 1950s and 60s to now. And she speaks about how, in the beginning, the civil rights movement was primarily led by grassroots, basically bottom up. It was a grassroots movement with representatives being actual representatives of those who were oppressed by the community. But she basically says that there was a type of shift to where you find most of the representatives of the civil rights community are not really your average citizen or your actual citizen who are being affected by these issues, more of attorneys, lawyers, legal experts who basically, she says, who don't really, who kind of somewhat have a different agenda. And so she basically says that, you know, this new type of representation, they're more concerned with legality than morality. Like she says that basically with this new shift in representation, instead of it being, you know, your average citizens, those who are actually being directly affected by these issues, to legal experts, lawyers, attorneys, those who, to a certain extent, are kind of part of the problem, they're part of this system, you know, the priorities change. And she says that becomes, while they still care about those who they're supposed to represent, their primary focus, of course, is winning cases and of course, really making arguments based off of legal interpretation and less about the moral issues behind this issue in the system. And due to that lack of proper representation, she feels this is also another reason why the civil rights community has been lax in responding to this issue. Now, the third point she makes is that this new type of, these new representatives in the civil rights community, in order for them to properly address this new type of racial disparity within the criminal justice system, they would have to represent those who are labeled as criminals. They would have to represent those who are drug offenders. And people who have been speaking for the past few classes, once someone is labeled a criminal, no matter what it is that they did, they automatically have this universal stigma against them by the community as a whole. No matter what they paid their debt back to society or what they did, having that label on a person automatically makes them universally condemnable, regardless of what they did or the circumstances, thus making it very difficult for attorneys and civil rights attorneys and lawyers to win cases when their clients whom they represent are those who are already labeled as criminals. It's not a question of whether or not they're innocent or guilty. The question is whether or not they're deserving of the treatment that they're given, and it puts them in a very difficult situation. She says that basically lawyers have more success with plaintiffs who are considered respectable and equal in the eyes of society. And she makes a very interesting reference to kind of back up her claim, something that I didn't know. She makes reference to Rosa Parks. All of us, of course, are very familiar with Rosa Parks, the very famous incident that happened during the civil rights era, where she refused to leave her seat to go in the back of the bus for a white person before she was arrested and convicted for this. She highlights that Rosa Parks, of course, her case is very famous. It's like in our history books, we're all very aware and very knowledgeable about the issue, about the incident story of Rosa Parks. But she brings to our attention that there were two other individuals that were arrested for the exact same crime as Rosa Parks, those who refused to move to the back of the bus. And these are two black women named Claudette Colvin and Mary Louise Smith. And she mentions that these two individuals, like I said, I didn't actually know this, were arrested for the exact same reason that Rosa Parks was. They refused to abide by the law of going to the back of the bus. But civil rights attorneys did not take their case. And the reason that the author gives as to why their cases were not taken was really because they were not seen as respectable law-abiding citizens. They were kind of seen as more of like a liability. So what I mean by that is, he mentions that, for example, one of them got pregnant by an older man. Another one's father was an alcoholic. So they didn't really fit the image of a respectable citizen, right? They kind of instead further played into the stereotype of, of the black community, those from the black community being, considered, unrespectable people. And the Rosa Parks fit the narrative that they wanted perfectly, because she was seen as a respectable citizen, someone intelligent, someone who was a valued asset of society. And since she fit the image and the other two didn't, her case was more representative than theirs was. And so she brings up that, due to that, in this new type of what she calls the Jim Crow, as we were speaking about for the past few months, most of the representatives, most of the clients that the civil rights community would have to represent would be those who are convicted criminals, those who have been arrested and convicted for drug offenses. And that makes it very difficult for civil rights attorneys. And she says, due to this, she feels that one of the main ways or methods to address this issue is to call for a major shift in perspective. Instead of just trying to focus on individual cases, she makes a mention how one could argue that you could just ignore those who are incarcerated, just kind of focus on some of those isolated cases where someone who was innocent or someone who's considered respectable to society was a victim of this case. Just focus on those individual cases, focus on education, affirmative action, just focus on some of those small reforms in isolated cases in order to make change. And the author argues that this is really not enough to overcome this new type of racial caste system. She instead calls for a universal change in perspective and understanding of what racism is and what race is. And one example she gives is she mentions about Brown versus Board of Education as an example of how focusing on just a few individual cases is not going to be enough to overcome this issue. She mentioned about Brown versus Board of Education, a case we're all very familiar with. This is a case that is heavily attributed as being like the starting point for making actual progress during the civil rights era. But she highlights that despite popular belief, Brown versus the Board of Education, after the Supreme Court ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional, all that stuff, 10 years passed without anything really changing. It was 10 years of stagnation, as she calls it. So while many times we have this perspective that after Brown versus Board of Education, everything started moving uphill from there on immediately, the author argues that didn't really happen. It took 10 years after that for any reasonable change to start happening. And within those 10 years, very little progress was made, the author argues. And she says that the only time when progress truly started being made was when there was an actual movement for a call of a change of public perspective and understanding of race. And she says she argues it's going to be through this type of grassroots movement where we can actually start seeing these changes. And from here, this is when she starts just going into the importance of basically acknowledging the race problem and the issue of color blindness. So from here, and after that, we'll go ahead and open the floor. So I'll just take maybe 2 minutes to talk about this, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. So the other point she mentioned is to acknowledge is that in order for us to see actual change of this issue, society as a whole needs to acknowledge that this issue of mass incarceration is not just a criminal justice problem. It's instead a race problem. And she speaks about how some people might argue that, well, okay, this mass incarceration is an issue, but yet, it is keeping crime off the street. And she makes mention that there's studies that show that mass incarceration is only really attributed to maybe 3 to 25% of crime reduction, if that. And she mentions other studies that show that basically imprisonment actually in the long term increases crime. Because as for all the issues we've mentioned, also for all the reasons that we've mentioned in previous classes about the long-term repercussions of those who are imprisoned and the types of charges are put on them for life. What type of negative repercussions do they face and what type of opportunities are taken away from them? And that in the long term, imprisonment can actually increase crime in many cases, especially in drug-related crimes. And so she says that if society as a whole does not acknowledge that mass incarceration was basically started for racial reasons, and that it's primarily a race issue, then progress will not be made. And basically, she's calling for like the end to the idea of color blindness. And it was interesting when she was talking about this because it kind of reminded me of what we spoke about last night in Brother Alim's class about the issue of African American Muslims or convert Muslims and their position in the Muslim community. And I remember that author, Imam Luqman, made the same case that in order for us to start actually tackling those issues, we need to first acknowledge the problem. Acknowledge that in that issue, it's a problem of race and a problem of cultural understanding. And so the author here also makes kind of the same argument that in order for us to make constructive change, first you have to identify and acknowledge that this is a race problem. And so we'll go ahead and stop there, and we'll go ahead and open the floor. Before I open the floor, I'm going to go ahead and stop the live stream. From there, we're going to open the floor to those of us who are tuning in on Zoom. For those of you who are tuning in on Facebook, inshallah ta'ala, we'll see you next week. Same time, same place, and next week, inshallah ta'ala, Sister Rashida will be finishing us off with this chapter.